Okay. Hello, everybody. As I said before, this is going to be a lecture in English. I hope it's all right, so everybody can participate. And I'm going to start by introducing myself because I don't know most of you. My name is Edmé Domínguez, and I have been working around at SGS for many, many years. I come originally from Mexico, but I did my PhD on the specialization of Soviet Union at that time. As a matter of fact, I'm here in Sweden, living in Sweden for also many years back because I met the person who became my husband in Moscow. So I did my PhD dissertation there, and not of Moscow University, it was French Institut d'études politiques. And I became, at that time, a specialist on Soviet foreign policy. Afterwards, when I came to work in Sweden, I changed a lot of these orientations. And I continue with international political economy, which was my dissertation, but also with other issues, especially with gender issues. But I have been following the situation in Russia, not the Soviet Union, for a long time. And even though my Russian is not as good as it used to be, I continue following this, and also many sources of which I took the information I'm going to present for you. Not only sources, English sources, but French sources, Russian speaking sources, etc. So what I'm going to present for you, and originally it was planned for my group, that's the course on peace and war, is a historical perspective and a perspective from Russia of what is happening today. So what I'm trying to offer is some kind of interpretation, explanation, if you want to get other kind of views of why this happened in general. So some of the views you are going to see here have been put in the press already, in the radio, in TV, etc. Some have not. And perhaps some of you will find that part of it can be also provoking. We shall see. I'm going to make, this is a long presentation. I have to make some kind of a break in the middle, and then we continue to what is happening really today. But I start right away. Okay, so some of the points that we're going to see today is history. This is a very relevant factor for explaining what is happening in Russia today. Then the dismantling of the USSR, and in my view, the lost opportunities at that time. The post-Soviet realities from the first to the third world, where Russia became to find itself, and confronting NATO's expansionism. Back from the third world, trying to get back this superpower status, and the constant fear for democratization in the near abroad, and I speak in the near abroad of Russia, of course. And as I said before, this has to be also a historical perspective, because otherwise we cannot understand many of the arguments that Putin is using today to explain what he's doing. So these are very old maps where you see the emergence of the first Russian state, which was Kievan Rus. And this that was surrounding what we know Ukraine today. So this was considered to be really the cradle of the Russian culture that went eastward afterwards, but was born in these territories. That's one of the main reasons or argumentations that Putin is using today to claim legitimacy. Yes.
Edmé, jag får avbryta dig. Den byter inte bild här. Så jag tror du delar fel skärm på något sätt här, tyvärr. Vi ser bara första bilden.
Jaha. Oj. You're not seeing this?
Jag ser Russia invading Ukraine, chronicle of a death foretold. Alltså din första slide.
Here, death foretold, yes. Let's see. Did you see this?
Jag ser inte, du byter.
Oh,
Kan du gå ut?
stop sharing.
Ja,
Okay, I will share again and see.
Ja. Vi ser samma bild igen här. Och det kan vara för att du delar nog skärm, tror jag, va? Hur är det? Du ser din pekare, så nu kan du flytta på den i alla fall. Ja, så där kan du göra. Du kan flytta på den bara.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
let's do it here so everybody looks at it. This is the points that we are going to see today, and then I don't know what happened here, but this is the first Russian state, as I said before, Kievan Rus. And what we see afterwards is this Rus that becomes a local power under the Prince Sviatoslav by the time 945, 972. And as you see, it's expanding, but it's expanding to the east. And some people have said that in reality, it's not that Ukraine belongs to Russia, but that Russia belongs to Ukraine, because the first state was created around Ukraine. So let's go to the year 988, when this Prince Vladimir adopts the Eastern Christian faith, and the church becomes part of the state legitimacy. This is also something which comes from this tradition, and that was something that put together as well very much the Ukrainian and Russian cultures together. Something else that will help to explain several of things I'm going to say is this invasion, the invasion of the Mongols, the Tartars that invade to the west, what we call part of Russia today. So this is Genghis Khan from that is going to put this crusade to the west first, unifying these local tribes and turning east to China, as you see in this map, and then going into the west. And that was what Genghis Khan created, the world's largest imperium in history. And that was, you could see, the precedent to what we see in Russia today. So this was very early, the 13th century. And here you have also 1279. And then from Kiev, we go to Moscow. And here is where we see that Kiev was taken by the Mongols, 1240. But then the Mongols never arrived to occupy Rus, which is at that moment the born-in Russian nation. But yes, the Mongols controlled several of the princes. There was not a nation. You have a lot of princes surrounding this nation, and they were controlled because they had to pay tribute to the Mongols. You have to keep in mind that this invasion from the Mongols, from Asia, is going to have extremely important, I would say, they're going to give feelings of this kind of fear for invasions, fear from what is coming from outside. This is the first, you could say, traumatic experience that's going to be part of Russian history. Then you see the gradual development of Moscow, that is a very small village, and that starts growing and growing, also the unification of the different prince halls all over the place in Eastern Europe, and Moscow growing. And then here another one is the expansion of Moscow. And that takes place from the end of the 13th century. Here we are saying 1261 to 1533. The expansion of Russia And the expansion of Russia, and you have to take that also into account, is going to be as part of this defense strategy against future invasions. That's going to be part, very much part of this Russian tradition. So then also these preconditions for this expansion, the favorable geography, the rivers, the forest, and then the fact that they got this legitimacy of being the third Rome after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So we see as well this Russian in Europe, this orthodoxy against Catholicism, which is going to be part of real politics at that time. Eastern Europe as orthodoxy against Catholic states to the West. And a very important figure here, which is Ivan IV. And I put it forward as well, because what we see of Putin today, he's trying to emulate these historical figures of Russian tradition. One of them, which is extremely important, is this Ivan IV, that is going to be Tsar from the middle of the century, 1547 to 1584. And it's for the West, Ivan the Evil, or some in the Russian tradition is also good, because it's going to conquest the last princedoms, Khanats of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia, and push back the Mongols. So he's going to consolidate this independence from the Mongol occupation, and is going to be a reformist as well, fiscal autonomy reforms, and to centralize power, which is very important also. Also, he is the first one to create a secret police, in a very terrible police. And after him, he kills his own son. After him, there's going to be a period that's called the time of troubles that lasts until 1630 and the arrival of the Romanovs. But keep in memory this, and and then we have Peter the Great, another historical figure. And why is he important? Also because it's a background for Putin. Peter the Great is a great reformer, because at the time he takes power, he recognizes a Middle Age kingdom, and he wants to modernize. That's in the 17th century, it's the illustration, and also he tries to learn from the West, and also to consolidate this empire that was already retaken from the Mongols and was expanding. So he comes with these enlightened reforms of modernization. He goes to the West and learns about this modernization. And he comes back and transforms the Russian state, builds a modern navy, conquers access to the Black Sea and to the Baltic, founds St. Petersburg, and then he defeats Karl XII, the Swedish king, in Poltava. So this is a very important period as well. And as I said before, extremely important to understand what Putin is doing. 1721, you have the end of this great Northern War, and Russia retains part of these Baltic territories, but is going to leave a lot of Finland. Then we have the Russian Empire as we are going to see it before the Russian Revolution. And you see, this has been expanding. So what the Mongols have done, that was to take an enormous amount of territory, is what the Russians are doing after expelling the Mongols more and more to the east. So this is an enormous empire already during these 2 centuries. And this empire is going to get another traumatic experience, which is the expansion of the French Imperium and the invasion of Napoleon in 1812. So they have an enormous territory, but they don't have enough forces to have a modernized army as the one that Napoleon has. And they are defeated time after time until Napoleon tries to conquer Moscow and to conquer a great part of Russia, and he fails because of the winter. But this is another traumatic historic experience that the Russians are going to have very, very present, in the sense that try to defend ourselves for any kind of risk of expansion, of invasion. And then we have a very weak empire, and I have no time to go through all the problems that the Russian Tsarist regime went through until the end. You have a very disastrous war, the War of Crimea in 1853, and then the Japanese War. We show that really they had a lot of weaknesses, and that's in the beginning of the 20th century. So then we see, because of these weaknesses and because of the First World War, that is the main reason that we see the Russian Revolution come to victory. So we see the whole Russian empire and regime falling apart. And during this First World War, there is a chaos and the Bolsheviks take power. And you see in this map as well how Russians, the Bolsheviks, are going to take part of this territory back from the hands of the army generals that were loyal to the Tsar. So here you have, for example, what they are recovering and what the White Army is taking into their hands, and they are going to be somehow defeated afterwards. Something else that we have to see is that after this revolution in 1917 and the end of the First World War, then we have this treaty, Brest-Litovsk in 1918, where the Soviet government accepted that Russia was to lose Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic territories together with Finland. So these were lost, and the Bolsheviks had to accept that. But the civil war continued. And during this civil war, Ukraine is coming back to the Soviet, what was going to be the Soviet Union, and not because it was conquered, but because there was a struggle of the Ukrainian Bolsheviks against their national government. And finally, the defeat of this national government. So at that time, and during the 20s, before Stalin consolidated his power, you will have a certain freedom for all the nations, all the states that are going to be part of the Soviet Union, keeping their language, keeping their culture. But when Stalin finally consolidates his power, and you know, that takes most of the 1920s, and when he finally, 1929, consolidates his power, he's going to start not only collectivization and many other reforms, but also Russification. That is very, very important, Russification. And in Ukraine, the national language and the culture are going to be discriminated against because the language is going to be Russian. So there is this feeling of encirclement after the First World War, and the burning Soviet Union at that time had the need for allies. And that's why at that time, first they are going to create the Comintern, the International Communist movement, but also they are going to try to put new revolutions in place in Germany and Poland to try to get allies outside that could help the young Soviet Union. So this is also important because the Soviet Union and the Bolsheviks knew very well it was very, very difficult to survive without any help from the external world, and also because they had suffered all this invasion and interventions. But these revolutions failed, and then they turned into what was the Third World at that moment, and try to support other kind of revolutions in this colonial world. That's another story, which I like very much, but I'm not going to tell much of that here. Here is another map, a historical map of the Soviet Union in 1922. So you have an annexation already of Ukraine back, and not, as I said, because they have taken, but because the Bolsheviks in Ukraine have taken power over the national government and taken Ukraine back to the Soviet Union. And also of many other territories that were liberated with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So what you see here is this is a period which is important as well, the Soviet construction of socialism in one country. Just to tell you a little bit about why socialism in one country. Because when the Bolsheviks take power, they are communists. They know very well that within Marx's ideas, Russia was not prepared to go to socialism because they didn't have the necessary economic preconditions to do that. They didn't have a really working class. They have mostly peasants. They were not an industrialized countries. And according to Marx, that socialism could never happen in countries where there was no industrialization. So for Marx, the only places that could carry out a satisfactory, good socialist revolution were England, France, Poland, but not Russia. Russia was an underdeveloped country. So in that sense, when they didn't get this support from the external revolutions that they had planned, then they said, okay, we are going to construct anyway socialists in one country. And that was the period, especially of Stalin, after these internal struggles, when Lenin dies. And then you have a forced industrialization. And it's always this fear of capitalist encirclement. And so collectivization, push, whatever it takes to enforce this kind of socialism in one country. Also a Russification of all territories in the USSR. And something else which I didn't put here is that during that time, many populations are going to move themselves from where they had settled before. And one of these movements is that many Russian populations are going to several of the republics that were part of the Soviet Union. And that means that you see a lot of Russian populations in Eastern Ukraine that were there as part of this migration during the time of the construction of socialism in one country. So they were everywhere. They became part of all these republics, which we didn't know then was going to be one of the problems afterwards. So before the Second World War, the Soviet Union had attained this status of big power, had managed to industrialize, and was somehow feared and respected. But there was a lack of preparation for the Second World War because of Stalin's paranoia that there were enemies everywhere, and he's purging also the best officers in the army. And but finally, he was attacked, or the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany, and then Stalin, instead of going back to say, we are going to defend communists, no, we are going to defend Russia, because he went back to nationalism as the resistance ideology during the Second World War. And here we see that after this World War, we can see Russia suffered enormous losses. Many other countries did, but most historians agree that Russia was the one that suffered most physically and in the lives of their citizens, more than 40 million victims during that time, apart from all the millions that had died during the collectivization and purges. And the negotiations that come after the war, and that's very important, are extremely mixed with distrust. Distrust from Stalin and insistence that Russia needed a defensive barrier. That will mean a conflict with the former allies, in which they don't want to accept that. And Stalin said, whatever you think, we need this defensive barrier. And what Stalin did was to try to establish these loyal governments in Eastern Europe, to put these kind of countries, the caution of defense of Russia, just to defend, just in case anything would happen, any other power would threaten Russia's security to invade again. During the Cold War, Russia is going to try to look for new allies. And then Stalin was never interested in what the colonial world at the time, the Third World. So it's a very interesting thing that the first who gets interested on this is Khrushchev. Khrushchev, who comes after Stalin. But Khrushchev does something else, de-Stalinization. He tries to reform the Soviet Union. And I used to say that Khrushchev is the last leader of the Soviet Union that believes in communism. He really believed. The leaders that come after Khrushchev are extremely cynical. None of them believe. They keep it as the rhetoric, but the one who really believed was Khrushchev. And he was also interested in the Second World, in the Third World, to get new allies there during this Cold War, and he puts together this ideology of national to revolutionary democracies to justify an alliance with these countries in the global South. And during this time, and that is part of the explanation of his support to the Cuban Revolution as well. But something else regarding China. China had gone through a revolution, and for China, the biggest leader in communism was Stalin. So China wanted to follow the Soviet model according to Stalin. So Mao became extremely Stalinist. So when Stalin was criticized after his death, and there was this de-Stalinization carried out by Khrushchev in 1956. And in 1956, Khrushchev exhibits all the crimes that Stalin had performed, etc. Mao is extremely unsatisfied, and he is very critical of this de-Stalinization, and he breaks away with the Soviet Union. So this is the first rupture between two communist countries after Stalin. That's very important because this will lead to a very important conflict that ends in 1979 with the border conflict. This is also important to take into account because now we have an alliance, but this is a fragile alliance because there have been several tensions, historical tensions between China and Russia. And those tensions come back to this time, as I said, de-Stalinization. At that time, there was the creation of what we call the IMEMO, which is it was the Institute of International Relations and World Economy, where these concepts of national revolution and a democratic revolution are elaborated to justify Soviet interest in North Africa and Cuba, where there's a combination of geopolitics and ideology. And also this East-West competition in the Third World that we'll see, where the Soviet Union is going to support several leaders from North Africa and also, of course, the Cuban Revolution. So we come back to that, the logics of expansion from the Soviet perspective, from the time that a territorial coercion was absolutely necessary to keep Russia secure. This is the logic of defense of Russia. And the Soviets seen by the West as potentially expansionist. They could not trust the West because the West had always treated them in a discriminatory way and not having any trust on them. So the Soviet views is the fears of potential aggression based on all the historical experience I have told you about. And so we have this defense through territorial expansion. This is the Russian Empire in 1914. And then we see from the Second World War till 1989, where we see all this caution of defense of Eastern Europe to protect the border to the west. And the border to the east was the sea. And so we see also that this border is absolutely a priority for the Russian mentality of its security. From 1991 to 2014, we see that there's also a transformation because discussion disappears. And not only that, we are going to see the expansion of NATO. But what we see in this post-Soviet era, this industrial power that never succeeded in updating the bureaucratic and structural hinders. And therefore, there was a crisis already in the 70s and the 80s, taking it to the dismantling of the Soviet Union. So there was a very, very deep crisis, an enormous corruption, of course, and a lack of any kind of legitimacy of this belief in communism. So we see the dismantling, we see the end of the Soviet Union, and from having been this other superpower, we go to Russia as the third world country. And not only that, we see Russia submitted to the shock therapy. Several Swedish economists are consultants in order to help the Russian government to go in this transition from a communist or socialist system to capitalist system. And you know, this shock therapy is what we call this neoliberalism in the 80s, which is extremely brutal. That means really privatizing everything, caring very little about social welfare, and leaving a lot of the population without any kind of security. So just to think, Russia was not so rich. Their level of standards before the dismantling of the Soviet Union, you could criticize it in many ways, but you didn't see poverty as you saw after 1991. So poverty comes like a shock. It's part of this shock therapy. I remember that from my trips to Russia, my first trip was in '79, and I was there when the Russian invasion to Afghanistan started, as a matter of fact. When I came back in the 90s, it was a shock to see so many poor people in the streets, especially old people that had nothing to eat, and they were selling all their belongings, old shoes or whatever, in order to get any money to survive. So this was this shock therapy. So you see a very, very difficult decade, the 90s, from this unstable stability to uncertainty and insecurity inside and outside the borders. And this is one of my points of the whole presentation. This was the lost opportunity of democratization, because we don't know what could have happened if there had been much more help outside, if there had been some kind of Marshall Plan instead of a shock therapy. What could have happened? Perhaps the creation of civil society. We don't know, because Russia, in spite of everything, was not Afghanistan. Russia had very well prepared human resources. You had the best the scientists, mathematicians, physicists, etc., from the whole world. They had a lot of resources. Human capital was there, but there was no help from the outside to put this together into a democracy. And what happened was that what we see is the creation of an oligarchy. And as one of my advisors was telling me in the 1990s, this was the greatest robbery in history, this privatization of all state property and this creation of this plutocracy, extremely greedy, extremely ambitious. And couldn't care less about the welfare of most of the people. So this is, for me, a lost moment in history where things could have changed. And I think the West was extremely responsible in this lack of insight of what could have been done. We see contradictory economic policies here up to 2014, liberalization of the economy. This is ambition to integrate into global markets, and this entanglement of official and private interest, more state intervention, more protection to local industries, but also more corruption, extremely extended corruption. And many key areas were recovered by the state: oil, gas, arms manufacture, development, and technology. And we can see something else that happens with the dismantlement of the Soviet Union when it happened is that already before that, the Soviet Union was the main producer of conventional weapons that were exported to the rest of the world. So the main producer of these weapons was the Soviet Union. And it came after the dismantling of the Soviet economy into private hands. And what they did was to negotiate all these arms with all kinds of movements in the world because it was a business. Yes. I think, yes. I think that during some time, the time of Yeltsin, there was an openness. There was a very cordial relation and a trust, a very deep trust that the West could help. Yes. So we see this unchain, all these manufacturers, etc. And then what we see, it's these relations with the West before Crimea, with a lot of ambivalence and misconceptions. Ambivalent because from admiration, we go to suspicion. And I said admiration and trust before, to suspicion and resentment, but also emulation, trying to copy what is happening in the West. And the Western perspective was just to sit and wait because Russia could be easily integrated into Europe, was thought at that time in the 90s. You know, it was the time of the end of history, liberalism, and so Russia was welcomed into capitalism. And they had to go through the shock therapy, but they could sometime become part of Europe. And Russia started to recover very slowly, but they start to recover and grow. And also going very close to Europe. In 2012, we see that 52% of all Russian exports went to the European Union, and also 42% of all its imports. There were lots of Western investments in the financial system, trade, telecommunications, infrastructure, and productivity increases. Also, integrating into the Western institution, Russia joins IMF, the World Bank, in 1992, and starts negotiations with WTO, World Trade Organization, in 1994, entering in 2012 because of certain protectionist policies, invited to join the G8 group in 1998, but of course, because of the invasion to Crimea, it was no longer welcome in 2014. And also became part of the G20 in Australia in 2014. So there were lots of capital flows, but also of trade frustration, because these flows went in and out very much to European banks. So many of this capital that was formed as well with this privatization of Soviet goods or Russian goods, benefit Western banks because they were more trusted than the Russian banks. And also they went to tax paradises as part of the profit of this oligarchy. And Russia, already from that time, prefers bilateral trade treaties, not multilateral with the European Union. But they had to accept that after Lisbon. And also, they were distrustful because the European Union spoke about a third energy package that was to diversify energy sources and to avoid dependence of Russian oil and gas, Gazprom. So what happened with the near abroad? Discussion of countries that were supposed to be the defense of the borders of Russia to the West. Russia struggles to stop disintegration of what was left from the Soviet Union, and you have two wars in Chechnya. One should say that more than anything, Russia became extremely distrustful and extremely, I could say, fearful of Islamism. That was the main reason for the invasion of Afghanistan, because they had seen the Iran revolution and they feared that this could expand to Central Asia in the Soviet Union. So Chechnya had to do a lot with stopping this Islamization. And also they wanted to maintain the influence of the near abroad, and they went into conflicts like the one in Georgia. They wanted to keep as many former Soviet republics within the new organization, this Commonwealth of Independent States that was created after the dismantling of the Soviet Union. But many of these Soviet republics left this Commonwealth. And then they wanted to establish an integration at the economic level, which didn't work so well either. Because many of the members wanted to try something else. And we see Georgia, we see Ukraine, we see many other former Soviet republics taking their own way. So they tried also to keep control in two areas, which, and that I should have said from the beginning, in this traumatized experience of foreign invasions, and also this need of security in the caution countries, we have two former Soviet republics that become extremely important for Russia to keep a control on. And one is Ukraine, and the other one is Belarus. So the others, yes, they are important, but not as important as Ukraine and Belarus. And in order to keep good relations with them, they keep this old tradition of subsidized goods to Ukraine, selling them natural gas and crude oil in exchange of influence and lower prices. And these two countries could sell part of their gas and oil to Western Europe and get the difference of prices and keep it as a profit. So when there was a critic from these countries to Russia, then prices could increase of these vital goods. Something else around this. When we speak about the Russian, and I have been very critical of using the word empire, which is being used all the time now. When we spoke about the Soviet Union, and even before that, the Russian state, why do we call it an empire? It's not just territorial expansion. An empire means that you are benefiting from these territories economically, that you are exploiting them. But when we see the situation that happened during the Soviet Union, the Soviet time, it was not like that. I mean, most of these republics were very benefited by the fact that the Soviet central system subsidized many goods. Of course, they got also raw materials from these countries, but they kept subsidizing a lot of goods, a lot of subventions to all these countries, which was not the case of other empires. Just look at the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, etc. That it's only about extraction, extractivism. that was not the situation with the so-called Russian Empire. That's why I don't like to call it the Russian or the Soviet Empire at that time, or even today. So what happened, here we want to explain the Russian reactions to the Ukrainian Spring. And here we go back to these fears of pro-democratic forces encircling and debilitating Russia. You have NATO and the European Union that, from the Russian perspective, are expanding. And the events in Maidan Square, according to Putin, confirm these fears. The collapse of a loyal government like the one of Yanukovych was seen as a provoke by the West. And as you see in Putin's rhetoric today, by neo-Nazist groups. Maidan Square became an example that could be repeated anywhere in the near abroad or even inside Russia. For example, the protests that took place in Russia during the winter 2011 and 12. And here is a map I wanted really to show very much to you, in which, oh, sorry. I don't know why this is working so bad, but precisely when, okay, I keep it like that. This map is very important. This is the enlargement of NATO. And perhaps you cannot see that, but here, this color is from the beginning, 1949, the countries that belonged to NATO during the time that became part of NATO. 1952, these the other countries that became part of NATO. 95, more, and then so on until the Greens come in, which is the former Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, 90, 99, 2004, 2009. And you see all these countries coming in. So I'm not saying that Putin is right in the sense that he argues that this is the main cause of this invasion. But I say that he's right in the sense that NATO expanded at the cost of what was considered to be the security circle of Russia, and before that, of the Soviet Union before. So this is one of the main issues of the present conflict, the expansion of NATO. And these are the facts. That's how NATO expanded. There has been a discussion as towards there was an agreement or not between Yeltsin, already from Gorbachev's time, and then Yeltsin, of what was going to happen with NATO. One of the things that you should take into account is that the Pact of Varsovia disappeared with the dismantling of the Soviet Union. That was the counterpart to NATO. That was the alliance of all the Eastern European countries with Russia as a defense pact. And that disappeared because the Soviet Union disappeared. So what was expected was that NATO would disappear as well. Didn't happen. NATO expanded. And that is one of the other points I wanted to make. One was what happened in the 90s when the Soviet Union disappeared and the lost opportunity of democratization. The second one is the expansion of NATO, which we see here very, very clearly. So could that have been different? That's an enormous discussion. But this is given the reason, the legitimacy that Putin and other leaders in Russia are looking for. NATO expanded at the cost of the security of Russia. Whether this is really threatening Russia or not, this is another issue. The point is that he's right. NATO expanded in these territories. So Ukraine and Crimea, 2014, how do you understand this Russian behavior? Is this Putin style, a historical design? And I think no, I think it's consistent with Russian historical thinking experiences during the last 3 centuries. plus decentralized leadership, leading and caring about popular support in economic crisis. And we shall see, it's not that Russia is going through an economic crisis now, but it's going through a legitimacy crisis. But this was counterproductive to integration into the world economy and to the strengthening of the Russian economy in times of decreasing oil prices. And I'm speaking of 2014. So here is Ukraine after 2014. Something else that I wanted to signal, and it's Crimea. After the Second World War and during all this period, Crimea was not part of Ukraine. Crimea was given back to Ukraine by Khrushchev, because Khrushchev was from Ukraine. So he gave back to Ukraine the control of Crimea, but after the Stalinization. So it was from the 60s that Crimea became part of Ukraine. So that was another issue that Putin alleged when he took control of Crimea again. And so this is a picture I took myself in the Russian Museum of History in Moscow in October 2017, as they illustrated this annexation of Crimea, saying this came back to Russia because it belonged to Russia, and says, I love Crimea, taken by people, young people. So at the internal level, we have a lot of authoritarism as well. The Russia's internal situation is more and more authoritarian the more we go into the second decade of the century. This authoritarian regime coming back to Russian conservative traditions, to a strong nationalism, the church as part of this legitimacy over Slavic culture everywhere in Eastern Europe. Russian values against decadent Western hostile values. This popular support for Putin strong since his first government and decreases only in 2011 because of the economic situation, but rises again after Crimea to 80%. There, yes? And then these elections in 2018 that confirmed this support. Something else, perhaps we can take a short break, but before that, just to point out that Putin was supposed to be a Westernizer when he came to power for the first time. But he belonged to this secret police from the beginning. So he had this very conservative and extremely authoritarian Russian mentality. So we don't know if he was really convinced that the West was going to help Russia or not. But the fact is that he became more and more convinced that the West was going to threaten Russia and that he could become the hero to bring back the status Russia had had during so many years. So you have to take into account, and also the support he's getting, especially after Crimea. Perhaps we do a short break, 5 minutes, and then we continue with the situation today.
Sounds good, Edmé. Sure. We have really only got one question about substance, Edmé. We got some other questions about to have the recording, and also to ask you to repeat the questions you get from the room or from the floor, so that we can hear them when people ask questions in Linksalen. Can you hear me, Edmé? I cannot hear you, but I think you. I don't know what exactly happened. We lost you. We lost. Now I hear. I think I hear.
Hör du mig, Bengt?
Ja, jag hör det. Yeah. Did you hear what I said?
Okej, vi tar en paus, men jag kan kolla på de här frågorna. Och jo, PowerPoint och inspelningen kommer att finnas på Canvas.
Bra. Men då finns det bara alltså frågan om att upprepa frågor som du får i salen. Så att vi hör frågorna och inte bara svaret då. Men det tar vi efterhand.
Ja, det kommer att finnas också frågestund efteråt.
Ja, då bara så att alla hör både frågor och svar.
Ja.
Vi är fortfarande rätt många, vi är 147 online här, det var 100 ja, lite drygt.
Ja.
Men det är rätt många online. Hur många har du i salen då? Hur många har du i salen? Jag hör dig inte. Ljudet är lite instabilt här, jag vet inte riktigt varför.
Ja.
Nej, nu hör jag det. Hur många har du i salen?
Vad sa du?
Hur många har du i salen? Är det fullt där eller?
Ja.
Okej.
Jo, jag menar, hela inspelningen kommer att finnas på Canvasen. Kanske vi kan också se till att alla får det. Inspelningen, alla de som vill få den. Jag ska kolla hur vi gör.
Skicka länken så kan jag distribuera den till alla Global Studies-studenter.
Ja. Okej.
Det finns en fråga där.
Hallå Hawa!
Ja, hej, det finns en fråga där ställd av Ortega om Ukrainas befolkning som skulle svältas eller någonting sådär. Tycker jag är en intressant fråga. Kolla på chatt, där finns det.
Ja, det finns det finns två, är det två frågor eller en fråga som är substantiell. Försökte inte Sovjetunionen svälta Ukrainas befolkning under den så kallade Holodomor? Jag vet inte riktigt vad detta är, men det kan du säkert med. Hon lyssnar inte just nu, eller? Lyssnar du?
I don't think she hears you, Edmé.
Nej, det tror jag inte heller. Jag tror ljudet är lite... Ja, vad ska vi säga?
Can you hear us? Edmé?
Jo, jag kan inte höra dig.
But we are saying there are questions on the chat. Chat function, you read them there. You can't hear us.
Jag kan inte höra dig.
Okay, well, sorry.
Du hör inte. Vi hör varandra här med, men du hör oss inte. Nu hör jag dig. Hallå?
Aj. Chill. So we were speaking about these authorities that comes much stronger afterwards, after Crimea especially. And then this popularity Putin has during this time, an extreme popularity, and also some kind of Russian taste for saying, now we have a strong leader, now we have the chance of coming back to the status of superpower that we had before. Now we have to be respected by the people in general. I remember I was in Russia in 2017, and when I spoke to students of the university in St. Petersburg, middle-class students, none of them was critical of Putin. On the contrary, they said they were very proud of Putin. They were very proud of Russia finally getting back to what it had before, to be respected, etc. So, but behind this, we have a social reality. And some of these are statistics I have taken from several parts. You have modern cities, modern new generations, but also growing unrest among them. And according to some surveys carried out in 2019, 53% of young people aged 18 to 24 years old wanted to emigrate. 27% of the population perceived itself as poor, even though officially there was only 13% that was considered to be poor. The retirement age was raised in 2017 by 5 years, and the value-added taxes, what we have MOMS in Sweden, raised up to 20%, which had an enormous impact on inflation. And also, you could see that 47 million Russians have no access to hot water, 29 million no access to running water, 22 million no central heating. Only 62% of the population has access to the commodities that average Europeans have. So also we have officially an unemployment rate of only 3 to 4%. The rural unemployment is 33 to 55%. There are about 20,000 villages which have been totally abandoned, and about 36,000 with less than 10 residents in each village, with no access to health or other facilities. Not to speak about the pensions. And we are here speaking about people that have survived wars and that have very little to survive with their pensions. If many people complain on pensions here in Sweden, you can just imagine what is in Russia, especially in the Russian rural world. So we see this closing of all democratic venues more and more the last 10 years. Domestic politics more and more authoritarian. Putin changed the constitution so he can stay in power until 2036. Most of the opposition has been crushed, and we see only the surface with Navalny and his group that didn't have a special political program, but they were denouncing corruption, which includes all civil society, big organizations, especially those questioning the official versions of history like Memorial, which was an enormous NGO trying to rescue the memory of all those that had been eliminated by Stalin and suffer enormous hostilities during Stalin period. All these are going to be eliminated because they are considered to be dangerous external agents. And also what we see here is that there are several sanctions that come from the West after the Russian occupation of Crimea. But then what happens with Russia? Then Russia tries to become less dependent from the West. There is a fund that has been created from the profits from gas and oil exports that today amounts to $190 billion, which is quite big, enormous. Russia has gold and foreign exchange reserves up to $620 billion US. Their public debt is only 20% of this GNP. In comparison, in the US, you have 134% of the GNP in public debt. In Sweden, it's 40%. So the macroeconomic indicators are quite positive in Russia. So that is part of the reason why they felt strong enough to support more sanctions as the ones that are coming. But economic growth was only 1%. Nevertheless, for Putin, this was not so important because what was important is to have the right macroeconomic figures. So, however, trade with the EU is still very important. The European Union is Russia's biggest trade partner. Up to 37.9% of its exports went to the European Union in 2020. and 36% of Russian imports from the EU. Russia is at the origin of 26% of EU's oil imports and 40% of EU's gas imports, which is one of the reasons why many countries in the European Union are very reluctant to punish Russia regarding the exports of gas. So the new national security strategy, which was published in July 2021, and which I didn't see much attention paid to. This is the fifth national security strategy since '97. It has been revised every 6 years. And the vision of this national security strategy is of a chaotic world. New regional structures threatening the established order, hegemonic powers trying to survive, and the weakening of international organizations. According to this, there are external destructive forces threatening internally Russia, trying to create internal conflicts, inspiring protests, introducing foreign beliefs and values, and trying to rewrite history. According to this text, and what they say, what are going to do to fight against these threats and these surrounding feelings, siege displayed by NATO, to decrease the dependence from the West and that dollarization of the economy, but also the need of social policies, education, health, to improve the welfare of the population. And the latest budget that has been approved by the Duma puts 24% for education, social security, and regional development. So they are conscious that there is a deficit regarding social services, and that this can create a lot of tensions. And so they say, we have to get much stronger here. We have really to try to improve this quality of life for the population. So in this security strategy, they also name the friends and the enemies. And according to this text, the loyal partners are, of course, this community of independent states, which is very decreased because now they have only Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. The Organization of the Treaty of Collective Security, which accounts for Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which it counts China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, India, Pakistan, and Iran. And the BRICS, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There's a special mention to China and India, even though China did not support the Crimea annexation. They didn't support it openly, but they didn't have so many criticisms to that. And that takes us to the alliance between Russia and China. There were new treaties of cooperation after these conflicts in the border in '69, but there was a long time but there was not much cooperation. So new treaties come in 2001. Then Russia tries to help to modernize the Chinese army. China did not support Russia in its war against Georgia in 2008, nor regarding the Crimea annexation. But the present relationship is stronger because of China's trade war with the US and the Western criticism of the Uyghur situation. So both China and Russia refuse the Western liberal model, Western democracy model, and the human rights discourse. They despise it completely, and both demand the respect to their alleged legitimate demands of territorial securities. In the Chinese case, this is the situation of Taiwan, but also of Hong Kong, of course. And China's reactions to the invasion, as you have seen in the press, is that China does not speak of an invasion, and they understand Russia's special interest and they don't try to condemn the invasion because they understand these security issues regarding Russia. So Russia, is this a reformist or a revisionist power? The collapse of the Soviet Union was seen by the present leadership as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And at the same time, there is a negation of the Soviet past, as I said before, in museums and the dismantling of this NGO memorial. There's the concomitant loss of superpower status, this agonizingly uncertain status panic. Russia has never experienced democracy, that's a fact, because they went from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union and then to the situation in the 90s, this chaos. The dismantling of the USSR in the 90s offered, as I said before, the possibility of a Marshall Plan to help a democratic reconstruction. But instead, it received a shock therapy in the growth of authoritarianism. So finally, why an invasion now? These are my own views from what I have seen. The expansion of NATO and the possibility of Ukraine joining provided an extremely good excuse to Putin. Western countries were perceived as weak in crisis. For example, the crisis in the US, the Trump effect, Brexit, the fall of Afghanistan, the strengthening of the extreme right and dissensions within the European Union, the pandemic. All these were for the Russian elite, for the Russian leadership, a sign of distress, a sign of weakness. And China was confronting the US and the West for its criticisms regarding Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, Taiwan. Putin, an agent and delirious leader, trying to become the one who restituted Russia its great power, glory. Paradoxically, he's using the same arguments as the West, the right to protect. If you have seen his speeches, he speaks of protecting the threatened populations of Eastern Europe, meaning the Russians living in these parts, from the neo-Nazist forces from Kiev. So he's using exactly the same kind of language of the West, the resolution to protect. On the other hand, most of the Russian population does not support this war and they cannot go and protest so much as they have done, but in a very limited way, because they have everything to lose. But this situation that we are seeing today, I think this can backfire for Putin's popularity and elite support internally. That's what the West is wishing for. And we see already from today's news, etc., many demonstrations that have been repressed. But this situation we are living today can also heighten the stakes for Europe and the US that have to pay what they have to pay to appease Russia. NATO has also a responsibility, giving Putin the excuse he needed. So what are the possible scenarios that we can see here? We can see an occupied Ukraine with a Russian loyal government in the same style as Belarus. But on the other hand, we have to take into account that Putin is in a corner. He will never surrender. But perhaps his legitimacy may be weakened internally. We don't know yet, but we hope so. Nevertheless, we have to confront this scenario, his winning of this battle and the adaptation of the West to this situation. Okay, some people have asked if I can share this PowerPoint. I will share this, and I will share, if this comes to a good end, the recording of this lecture as well. I have a list of references of what I have been using and are using all the time, so which comes as part of this presentation. So now I finished, and I open the floor for questions. So perhaps we start with the people here, and then we go to the people listening in the Zoom level. Yes. You know, the Russian policy is not so clear cut as these are my friends and these are my enemies. They are also very pragmatic. And for example, the relationship, I'm not speaking about Moldova, but this is certainly the same case as Belarus. Before the crisis with Lukashenko.
You don't hear me, right?
Hello?
You hear me, or do you hear me now? Hör du mig, Edmé?
Yes, yes.
Kan du upprepa frågan som du får i salen? Så vi...
Okay. There was a question on Moldova and Transnistria and about the relationship between Russia and these two territories. And I was answering that the Russian leadership is always a very pragmatic leadership as well. And I will put the example of Belarus, even though this was a question of, but just to explain that before the crisis of Lukashenko and the popular protests against Lukashenko that we saw 2 years ago, Russia had a very love and hate relationship with Belarus, in spite of the fact that Belarus is a dictatorship, has been a dictatorship for many decades, and was to have a good relationship with Russia. But it was trying to become more independent from Russia. Nevertheless, Russia didn't occupy Belarus. And they left Lukashenko because they knew that Lukashenko was in the bottom, it was dependent of Russia. As I said before, the subsidized prices of gas and oil, etc. And so they are pragmatic in that sense. And even if Lukashenko wanted to become part of the European Union, approximately, they left it. They let him do that, as they did with Ukraine at a certain moment as well. So they were, or they are, used to this and prepared to give some flexibility to this relationship. It's not that they want to have 100% loyalty from these regimes. What they cannot forgive is these regimes joining NATO, because it's joining the enemy. But you can explain that with Moldova, you can explain that with Armenia, you can explain that with Georgia, with many countries in the region that can be partially critical, etc. One thing is joining the European Union, and another thing is joining NATO. So even if Ukraine had come to the phase of joining the European Union, I think if there had been not such a crisis as the one we have seen, they could have let Ukraine join the European Union, but not NATO. You see, that's a limit they put. There was before we go, yes, a question. What is the Russian end game, and what is needed to stop Russia? Is that your question? No, I don't think so, unfortunately, and I'm very sympathetic of the resistance from Ukraine. You see, this is a very difficult question, because nothing will stop Russia. The only thing that could stop Russia is a military intervention in Ukraine, which is not going to happen. Why not? Because Ukraine can never count on this defense that could in peril put in risk a new nuclear war, you see. And NATO knows that very well, so they will never go so far. So And Putin knows that. And he has also threatened anybody who involves in this and get mixed in this has to face the consequences. And many people have translated this into nuclear weapons, which is not clear for me, not really that clear, but we cannot stop it right now. And I don't think they can resist for a long time, because everybody agrees that the Russian army and the capabilities they have, they outnumber the Ukrainian one. And how far will the EU go to defend Ukraine? Not so far. That's the problem as well. As I said before, Russia is extremely well prepared economically. They have been getting ready for this before, and nobody noticed before. I read an article from a professor in economics here from Handelshochschule saying, no, Russia is in economic crisis. They will never cope with the sanctions. That's not true. Russia has been getting more and more independent economically. That is the problem, and nobody has noticed that. They cannot import cheese, they cannot import food. They prepare that now in Russia. So that is not the issue. So what can stop Russia is an agreement of some kind. I don't see any other solution in the short run. Now we can go to some questions here, Bent.
Yeah, we have quite some questions. We have one that is about the rationale. What can Russia gain from the invasion? I think you have definitely touched upon this more or less during your entire lecture here, but maybe you can just sum it up, because it's of course an important central question for you. The first one, what can Russia gain from the invasion? What are the possible returns, if any?
Can gain a lot. First, what they claim is respectability, to be considered a superpower again, to get the status they lost in 1991. Second, a stop of the expansion of NATO. That's what they can gain. And some kind of respect internationally, because now everybody's condemning Russia, but there are many countries in the global south that are just expecting something there and not so convinced that Russia is the bad guy in what we are seeing today. So yes, Russia is trying to gain this status back, this respectability, and that's one of the reasons why they don't want to negotiate with Europe. They want to negotiate with the US. They want to negotiate with NATO. You have seen in the security document that I mentioned in the presentation, they name all these allies they have. They don't name the European Union one single time in that document. For them, it's not important, the European Union. You see, what is important is NATO, what is important is the United States, what is important is China. And they get the support from China. And they knew it. That was the reason Putin went to China for the Olympic Games. And he got the promise he would get the support, as we see now. He also promised not to invade before the end of the Olympic Games, as you saw it.
Okay, Edmé, there we have two historical questions. There's one about when did the district of Ukraine, when did the distinct Ukrainian identity first emerge? Were Ukrainians considered a separate people during the time of the Russian Empire? And yeah. And then we have another one which has to do with the Holodomor, the genocide.
But the first one, I didn't get it, Bent.
It's about when did the distinct Ukrainian identity first emerge, and if it was a distinct identity during the Russian Empire. Do you hear? Did you hear me?
I hear, and I don't. Let's see if I see when. So
1430.
Yes. When did a distant Ukraine? Okay, when a distant Ukraine identity first emerged, where Ukrainians consider a separate people during the time of the Russian Empire. Ukraine has always been a different people and different culture, but extremely close to the Russian one. As I said before, Ukraine could claim that Russia belongs to Ukraine. I mean, instead of the opposite. So they have been a distinct national since Russia exists. I mean, they got a parallel development there. And as a matter of fact, Ukraine was part as well, part of Ukraine that didn't exist, was part of a Swedish empire. So Ukraine has been floating there, but the culture has always developed in a parallel way. So you cannot say from that time, but it has gone through centuries. Okay, what else?
We have, I think maybe we can prioritize a little bit. I think that people might be worried about nuclear war and Third World War. There's a lot of rhetoric about this now. So there are two questions. I just want to link them together. One is is it probable that NATO will intervene in Ukraine? And also the link question, is it credible that, that Putin threat to use nuclear weapons if the West would intervene? So is it likely that nuclear weapon will be deployed in this war?
I don't think so. No. I don't think that Putin is prepared to go that far. And I don't think that NATO is prepared to intervene militarily in Ukraine. And from the news that we are hearing even today, President Zelensky was very disappointed because he was feeling that he was abandoned by the European Union, etc., because the sanctions were not enough to protect him. The sanctions will never be enough to stop the Soviet invasion, not in the short run, because the sanctions will be felt in the long run or in the middle run, not now. So we have to wait for a time for these sanctions to have some kind of effect. And in the short run, they will occupy anyhow Ukraine. Yes? Yes. What effect would have any kind of resistance within Russia? You know, as I said before, this authoritarian political regime has developed enormously, especially in the last 10 years. One of them, and one of the preparation of Putin for this invasion was to crush opposition. Not only Navalny, but any kind of opposition from NGOs, civil society, etc. So that is to answer your question. He wanted to neutralize any kind of opposition to this kind of activities, invasions, whatever. He knows that there is a resistance to that because Russians don't want to have more people killed in wars like it was horrible in Afghanistan and etc., etc. But there is not, you could say, any kind of preparation from civil society to oppose this. I mean, you see a lot of small demonstrations that are immediately crushed by the police and people are taken to prison. A general strike, I don't think so. And even when it happens, I don't know if it's going to be so effective. We had the general strike in the case of Belarus against Lukashenko, and it didn't work because Lukashenko had the army to support him. So in my view, the only possibility to stop Putin, it's an opposition within the leadership, the oligarchic group, the army. The army has the key. But if they continue supporting Putin, I don't think there is any kind of civil society sufficiently strong to stop him. In the long run, perhaps, but not now.
But that leads to a follow-up there. Do you think there will be such an opposition that can be significant? I think, I mean, in the army, or given that there are some protests here and there, that are these protests, is that the tip of an iceberg, that there actually is much more opposition under the surface, and that opposition also reach into the what can we say, the Russian elite, or those who have any say in politics in Russia?
Yes, I think that there will be an opposition growing, increasing, but not now, not in the short run. Opposition will grow when they feel the effect of sanctions, when they feel this is really coming too close in this sense. If they feel that, then the opposition will grow much more quickly. Yes. Okay, I will repeat the question. If I think that things will change if somebody kills Putin, is that right? Yes, perhaps that could happen, but Putin is not the only one. He has a whole core of people supporting him. So that depends how debilitated this group becomes. You see, we see only the figure of Putin, but there's a whole group behind him.
Oh.
Yes, exactly.
What is the question, Edmé?
The question is the army, if they're good, what do you say, debilitate the group that is supporting Putin. I think that it's a very difficult question to answer, because of course, if you divide the army, if you put some kind of questioning of what is happening within the army, yes, then there is a big possibility that he will be removed. But nobody knows. I mean, the army, this is extreme closed system. And as I have heard, the most experienced experts in military, nobody knows what is happening there. So we don't know if there is any kind of possibility of this happening. Jan? Casualties. Jan is asking if Ukraine can turn into an Afghanistan war, in the sense of having a lot of casualties for the Russians, and also a lot of resistance, small resistance in guerrilla war. Yes, that's a possibility, but I don't think the casualties from the Russian side will be so high, because technology has changed in Afghanistan, and the situation in Afghanistan was completely different. You have a rural environment in Afghanistan. You have religious groups that are very consolidated there, and you didn't have the technology that you have today, in the sense of protecting the people who are invading. So I think what Putin is planning, or has planned, is a very quick war. And then a dismantling of the government in place to put some of the government with loyal people for him. What he is dismissing or I don't know if miscalculating, is the kind of long-time resistance to this kind of government. And that could be costly in a long term, but not in the short term, because they know they have a lot of strength and capabilities to fight a very quick war, which is hybrid, which is technologically, internet, etc., and also in the terrain, in the air, and so on. So I don't think they could see the same kind of scenario that they saw in Afghanistan. And yes, there will be a resistance, but for how long?
Edmé, Hawa has raised her hand, but there are two questions maybe that you could address in the chat that I think are sort of overall big questions that I think you would like to answer. One is, will Putin go on? Some of the if you like rhetoric from NATO's side is that we have to stop Putin now. He will go on. He will not stop until he has recreated the Soviet Empire. Is that true? Do you think that there is an sort of a larger plan here to recreate the empire? And then the other question has to do with China, and if China is about to turn here, maybe we'll put some pressure on Putin to stop. What do you think?
Yes, in the first question, no, I don't think that Putin plans on recreating the Soviet so-called empire and recovering the control of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics. No, I don't think so. I presented in the beginning these territories that are absolutely crucial for Russian defense since many, many centuries back, and that is Ukraine and Belarus. And the other ones, they can be maintained in the same kind of terms as before, we said with Moldova, with Georgia, etc., in some kind of flexible loyalty that can variate, but it doesn't mean that they are going to be recovered territorially as Ukraine. I don't think this is an expansion of the former Soviet territory or even or the rest of Europe. That's why when I hear the news and Swedish preparing its defense, etc., I said, no, you have not got it. Putin is not after creating a new empire. Putin is after making his point. We don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. We don't want Ukraine to be part of the West. And we don't like this democratization that is taking place. But it is not about reconquering the whole empire. No, I don't think so. That's my opinion. And the second one was?
Well, it's about China. If China might be, yeah.
Yes. Well, we have to take into account that China is extremely pragmatic. We know that. China became extremely capitalist and very successful, as we know. And Putin has calculated very well that China would support this invasion because there's a long conflict with the United States. I mean, China would prefer to continue with good relations, good trade relations, and pragmatic relations with the West, and especially with the United States. If China was given the choice, they prefer the United States to Russia. But the situation is such that there is no conciliation between the United States and China. On the contrary, Biden is putting his feet in the East Asia and Asia in general, saying we are not going to accept more expansion of China's influence there. So, you know, this alliance with Australia, etc., etc. And China regards that as a challenge because the United States is not respecting China's sphere of influence and is really questioning China's influence in general. And that means hostilities. So that's why Putin said, now it's my time to do it because China is extremely angry with the United States. So, yes, because of this pragmatism. How long will it go, this alliance? We don't know, but for the time being, it's quite strong. And China knows this alliance with Russia will bring losses, economic losses for China as well. They are prepared for that as well in the short run and even in the middle run, because they are very successful economically. And they have become as well quite independent, not dependent as they were of foreign investment. So yes, they are ready to make trade with the West, with the United States, but they are also ready to carry on as they have been doing before.
Mm.
And the Global South is very open to them. So China will go as far as they think it's going to agree with their interests.
Okay, thank you, Edmé. I think how are you still in?
If you let me.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you very much for this interesting. I especially appreciate the long-term perspective. So we can see the ups and downs and the, and we arrive, we land where we are. That is very important. And I think it's something that I appreciate in this lecture very much. So I have two questions. The first quick one, you're saying, you said the economic, whatever, the things that the Western countries are doing, to stop trying to punish Russia, the sanctions. You are saying the effect will be not immediate. And I really wanted just to emphasize the first question, that is, now the financial dimension, that is the banks being excluded from the global transaction mechanisms. Are you really certain that that is going to be long-term? In terms of the trade and exchange, you've given the percentages and, of imports and exports and so on. So are you sure that's not going to be instant? So
no, I'm not completely sure, but I think that most of these sanctions will function on the middle term. In the short term, yes, they can hit, but that's why they are associated with China, because China was also looking for ways to neutralize these sanctions. And the trade, for example, was going to, and the banks in the financial system was going, there are plans from the China side to neutralize this kind of sanctions. So instead of doing this trade with the West, they are going to do this trade with China and be helped, supported financially by China. How much this will mean to neutralize these sanctions, I don't know, perhaps very much or perhaps not as much. But I think that these sanctions will not save Ukraine in the short run. That's my point. Mm.
Can I say my second question? That's actually almost an aside. The main question I wanted to ask is actually, comment about, is that to keep in mind that the global system we have is built on this respect for territoriality and, the definition of what is a state and non-interference, especially. And that's one. The second point in relation to that question is that in the global governance systems we have created at the moment, the Security Council is the highest political body we have, citation marks. And there Russia is the one of the 5. And now the member of that Security Council is actually the one breaking those principles that we have lived by in the last 70 years. So my question is really, what are the potential of the coming years, not only in Europe, but around the world? The extent to which nation states, I do citation marks again, will actually maintain this principle of defining a nation state as this significance of the non-interference. And I want you to think also behind that, the fact that in fact the countries in the West have been interfering in other nation states. I'm just throwing that into the mix to say, what is the prospects of globalization and respect for the boundaries of nation states as a source of preventing war, conflict, violation of human rights and whatnot, considering what has just happened. And the Security Council is supposed to this morning vote against this? I mean, I'm just saying the mix. So I'm now asking you as a political scientist rather than the specific case itself about the potential for tomorrow. Thank you.
My God, that is very, very complex. I don't think I can answer so directly that. I mean, we both know that the principle of non-intervention is extremely has been used in extremely flexible ways, both by the West and the East. But it's still, I would say that this principle and this kind of real politics are extremely important for Russia and China. I mean, here you're studying international relations, you are questioning all these principles of their realistic, realism, etc. And we say, no, we have to have critical theories around this. But this is not the case of Russia. Russia still thinks on these terms. I mean, they think very much in the Cold War terms. You have to understand that. And the same is China. And their understanding of non-intervention and these borders, inviolability of the borders and sovereignty is extremely flexible according to their own interests. So what will happen? I don't think it will happen much. It will continue as indefinite or as depending on who is saying, who is trying to defend these borders as before. Depends very much on the interpretation you give to them.
So I'm saying the credibility of the Security Council.
The credibility has, yes, the credibility is not very high and will not be very high in the future. And now they are going to pass this resolution into the General Assembly, and perhaps we will see something else in the General Assembly. But I mean, what can you do with the Security Council as it is? Now, there is no, I don't see any signs of reform of the Security Council in the short term. There was somebody else trying to. No.
What was the question, Edmé?
Yes.
What was the question?
The question, if there is a chance of the Security Council reforming in the short term, and I don't think there is any chance. Okay. Anybody else? We are coming to the end. 3 o'clock.
We have more questions in the chat here, but time is up, I think, and hope you can find answers to your questions. There are some questions about, of course, if Ukraine I mean, how long can they resist? And of course, that is a decisive question here, of course, because if they do not resist, if they fall right away, of course, then the situation will be very different for Putin compared with if they carry on for month after month in a civil war. But I don't know if you have any opinion on this. This is a decisive question, of course.
That's something we had been discussing before. And I mean, according to his plans, Putin thinks this is going to be quite short. Yeah. The war is going to be quite short. The last question, yes. They have entered Kiev now. You see, they have entered Kiev now. In the hub, just happens. So that's what I said. I mean, he wanted a very short flash war. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you, Edmé. It was really nice of you to let us all in on this. Thank you so much.
I'd like to speak to you for 1 minute more, Edmé, before you disappear.